I'd like to give an introduction to Muktza, and we could begin really with the sugya on Daf Mem Gimel of Migudis Katzoi, and that's the case of menorah, of a ner shayidolek already on Erev Shabbos, and the shemen shebener. Let's take this concept of Migudis Katzoi in the context of a Gemara here on Daf Mem Gimel regarding Tevel. Gemara says, about 10 lines down from the top on Mem Gimel, Tevel muchan hu etzel Shabbos, shim avar v'tikno misukan. Tevel is Muktza because it's not royal achila. However, if he went ahead and he violated Issur Shvus and he was mafresh, trumas and maestros from the Tevel, then it's mutter. And Tosfos in Masechet Be'er, long Tosfos here, very complicated. On Daf Lamed Aleph on the Beis, Ibar Maskil B'Nifchas, as a whole discussion about what seems to be a contradiction. How can you, on the one hand, maintain that Tevel is Mukhan, and therefore, after he was masakin it, and he was mafresh trumas and maestros, it's no longer Muktza? What about the principle of Migudis Katzoi ben Hashmashos? Ben Hashmashos is certainly Muktza. Nobody argues that it was Muktza ben Hashmashos. Tosfos comes up with a distinction based on a Rashi between the Rabbanans, when the Issur is the Rabbanan, like Tevel, which is only a hafrasha of the Shvus, as opposed to Shchita, which is Doraisa, and he quotes the Gemara in Chulin. And Tosfos rejects this based on a sugya b'efrochim, and finally he quotes Rabbeinu Moshe with a very complicated distinction, in which he says, "Sham Muktza eino mistalik min ha'olam kigon mo sal gavi kikar." Then we say Migudis Katzoi, but Tevel miyad shetikno at Tevel mistalik ha-Muktza mikol v'chol. All right, whatever Moshe means, that's sort of clear. You have to understand. Let's raise the following suffix with regard to understanding this principle of Migudis Katzoi. There are two, I think, basic fundamental ways of understanding Migudis Katzoi, and perhaps in the light of at least one of these two definitions, we can understand why Tevel is Muchan. One way of understanding Migudis Katzoi is that there was an Issur that was Chal going into Shabbos. Once there was an Issur Muktza going into Shabbos, then that Issur is Chal for the entire Shabbos. You cannot change the status of an Issur once it's Chal. In fact, the Gemara at the beginning of Beitza wants to know what happens if Muktza, in the case of Nolad, falls into a Taroves, and whether we apply the principle of Davar Sheish Lo Matirin, Afilu B'Elef Lo Batel. All this has to do with the fact that Muktza is a Davar Asur. And if a Davar Asur gets mixed up with Heter, we can talk about Bittul. So Migudis Katzoi is a way of formulating the following, that once it is a Chefta D'Isura, then what is going to be matter that Chefta D'Isura? It's an Issur for the entire Shabbos. The Issur is Chal for the entire Shabbos. So Shabbos becomes one entity of time that's indivisible, and the Muktza generates an Issur going into Shabbos. Once it's Asur, remains Asur for the entire balance of Shabbos. Oh, Dilma, perhaps we can understand this principle in a different way. The Gemara at the beginning of Be'er derives the principle of Muktza from a pasuk from a parasha in the Torah, V'chinu es asher yaviv. Muktza is the opposite of Hachana. The halacha of Migu tells me that the Hachana has to be Chal Ben Hashmashos going into Shabbos. You cannot set up a hachana for Shabbos in the middle of Shabbos. There's one critical moment for hachana, and that's bein hashmashos. If it's muchan for Shabbos. If it's not muchan, then it's Muktza for Shabbos. And therefore, Migu Diskatsoi tells me that once you're lacking hachana, it becomes Muktza for the entire Shabbos, because hachana has to be implemented, or Maisa hachana, as we go into Shabbos. The Ritva in Sukkah, in the Sugya of Atzei Sukkah, seems to learn that shot. That Migu Diskatsoi is based on the fact that I have to designate something for use on Shabbos. And in lacking hachana, it's not muchan, and therefore it's muktzah. So the essence of muktzah then is the absence of hachana. And the only possible moment for hachana, according to Migu, is bein hashmashos. I want to pick up the second definition for a moment. That, as the Ritva seems to indicate in Masechta Sukkah, Muktza and Migu is a result of the lack of hachana, which has to take place going into Shabbos bein hashmashos. Because if this be the case, then perhaps we could shed a light on the sugya of Teva. The Gemara says, listen carefully to the language of the Gemara. Rashi emphasizes it. Tevel muchan hu etzel Shabbos. What does that mean, Tevel muchan hu etzel Shabbos? How could Tevel possibly be muchan when the Rabbanan in Shvus Issur the Afrasha? So you can't be mafresh. How could it be considered muchan? Yet the Gemara says muchan hu etzel Shabbos. And why? Shem avar b'tikno having mesukan. What the Gemara is saying here, I believe, is an answer to Tosfos' Kashin Be'er. Tosfos asks, what about Migu Diskatsoi? The answer is, there is no Migu Diskatsoi here. It doesn't apply in the case of Teva. Because what is Migu Diskatsoi? It's the lack and the absence of hachana going into Shabbos. If it's no muchan in bein hashmashos, it's no muchan for the entire Shabbos. Comes along the sugya of Teva with a gewaldige chiddush. Tevel is muchan. What do you mean it's muchan? It's muktza. How can you call it muchan? And we have now a halacha, which is very, in a sense, complex and paradoxical, that something could be muchan and muktza at the same time. And I say this now as we begin learning muktza, that this is an amazing chiddush over here in the sugya of Teva. It's almost as if I can do a hachana al shem ha'asid. Normally, who are you fooling? You can't say that this is muchan. It's now also you haven't been mafresh. You cannot be mafresh on yontiv. But yet, the Gemara says that because of avar v'tikno harezim v'sukan, I can already make tevel into muchan going into Shabbos. Hence, I don't apply the principle of Migu Diskatsoi. Maybe it works on Afreya. Maybe what it means is after I make a tikkun, then my afrasha generates some Afreya achad on Erev Shabbos, Erev Yom Tov. I don't know. I'm not sure if that's the only way you have to say it. Well, one thing is crystal clear from the Gemara, and sometimes I think we read the Gemara and we miss the point. That Tevel is considered muchan. If it's considered muchan in our second definition, then it's not muktzah. And that perhaps is why the Ritva is not willing to accept our first definition of Migu. If you go with the first definition of Migu, namely that you have something that's also because Muktza is Issur. There's an Issur Muktza. There's either Doraisa, we'll speak about it, or Dorabana, but there's an Issur Muktza. And if the Issur Muktza is Chal, it's Chal for the entire Shabbos. Nothing that you do during the course of Shabbos to be marked that Issur could remove the status of Muktza, because Muktza is Issur. Once also, it's also for the entire balance of Shabbos. But if we go with the second definition, namely that Muktza is a result of the lack of hachana, and Migu means that the only moment which is appropriate for hachana is Erev Shabbos bein hashmashos going into Shabbos, then we can understand the Gemara about Tevel. Again, when the Gemara is going to apply, I don't know. Many Rishonim seem to assume that you could apply this principle of Muchan to any Issur D'Rabbanan. Any time D'Rabbanan asks something with Torah Shvuz, you can apply it. I would say, just logically, in the way we're presenting, I'll be right with you, Yonatan. I just want to finish one last point, that this might be a halacha specifically in Teva. I'll tell you why. Very often, we find in Shas a svara of omed. Right? For example, you could talk about, peros that are fully grown and developed on a piece of karka. You haven't yet harvested, but it's omed likotzer k'tziradam. Or, for example, you can find in Issurim, like, for example, you could talk about something that's omed lebittel, and we already foresee that there will be bittel. So this concept is very relevant to the case of Tevel, because what is Tevel? Tevel is a chiyuv hafrasha. The obligation and the mitzvah of hafrasha is shumas of ma'asros. It's what generates the Tevel. I am obligated to be mafresh this Tevel. So the Tevel is omed la'afrasha. And if it's omed la'afrasha, there's a hachana al shema asid. And we find that there are precedents to this concept. Why is Avodah Zarah, for example, Ketuse Mechte Shiura? Because it's Omed L'Streifa. The Torah commands me to take Avodah Zarah and all Issur Yana and burn it. Once it's burnt, I don't have a shear. I can't take a lulav of an asherah. It's Omed L'Streifa Kisarav Dam. We already anticipate the Streifa, even though what I'm looking at is a beautiful asherah, a wonderful lulav. If you would have fooled me, I would have paid hundreds of shkalim for this lulav, but now I find out that it's an asherah, and it's omed l'sreifa, etc., etc. So if you'll take a look, I don't know if you ever heard of Rav Amiel. He was a chief rabbi at Tel Aviv. That's because he defeated my Rebbe in the elections, the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. And the rest is history. Anyway, Rav Amiel wrote a 3-volume work called Hamidos Lecheker Aloch. I haven't seen it in years. If you get a hold of it, let me know. The only kind of student who can appreciate Rav Amiel's writings, 3 fat volumes, is a Telzer. If you didn't learn in Telz, don't even bother with it. But Rav Amiel was a Telzer, but he has a whole section on Kol HaOmed. If I remember correctly, I haven't seen it in a long time. Yonatan.
Yeah, I just want to say, why can't you say someone who just said now is an explanation for Side of Not side of
Say it one more time, Migu.
Muktza Lagavi Migu. According to the first mouth, say in regards to devil, that it's only chal something that has one singular definition. Actually, King tell us since it lends itself. Some extent, and therefore there's a concern of the chalos.
Correct. Maybe you could say the chalos Issur is sort of a temporary Issur, and that is going to impact on Muktza. Maybe even if I assume the first side of Hakira, that once it's also as a cheftzid Issur, it's also the entire Shabbos. Maybe Tevel is a different kind of an Issur.
No, that's what I'm saying. It just doesn't have a full. The chalos is different.
No, it's also now. Nobody denies that before you mafresh, it's also. So it's a cheftzid Issur of Muktza. But maybe you could say, and then, and again, in both Mahalchim, what we're saying is that there's something different about Muktza in the case of Tevel. It's Omed La'afrosh. I would add, it's a mitzvah to be mafresh. And I'll tell you the truth, I don't think it would make any difference whether or not the Issur was the Issur Afrasha or any other Issur was the Raisa D'Rabbanan. Who cares whether it's the Raisa D'Rabbanan? If we're going to apply the principle of Omed, and it's as if he was mechaded for the after Hafrasha, then I can apply that even on an Issur D'Oraisa.
That's a candlesticks. Oil in the kabot. Oil for 6 hours.
So we'll talk about that soon in Mirza Hashem. I hope so. I hope so. For Rabosai, I'm wondering if we can answer a question that is very perplexing. If you take a look at Tosfos in Shabbos on Daf Mem Gimel, there are two Tosfos that begin with the word Ba'odam. I'm looking at the first Tosfos, and again, I'm pulling something out of the middle of the Tosfos, which is obviously foul play, but for our purposes as Akdama to Muktza, Tosfos has an analysis of a principle called Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos or Ein Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos. And Tosfos has a revolution regarding that principle. The sugya of Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos is a suffix of Hillel in Beitza Daf Chavava Midbeis. Boy Minei Hillel Mirava. This is not Hillel, Azokeh. Hillel and Amor. Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos or Ein Muktza. The Gemara explains the Achse v'Hadar Idchi v'Hadar Ichse. In other words, the peiros were dry and edible going into Yom Tov or going into Shabbos, and then the rains came down and they got wet in the middle of Shabbos, and they're unedible. Then the sun came out, and it dried again. Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos or Ein Muktza L'Chatzi. That's the Gemara's stuff. Tosfos says the following: What the Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos Hainu L'Achila V'lo L'Tilta. We know that in Muktza, there are two different Issur. There's an Issur Achilas Muktza and Issur Tiltul Muktza. Achila is always more chamur than Tiltul. For example, the Shita Muktza is very famous at the beginning of Be'ah, and he says that Achilas Muktza is Dorais. The Pasuk V'chinu Aser Sher Yaviu addresses Achilas Muktza. Kuliyama Lo Pligi, that Tiltul Muktza is only Drabban. I only mention this to you because I want to emphasize that distinction between Achila and Tiltul as a fundamental one. According to the Shita Muktza, it's hands down. I mean, you're talking about comparing a Doraisa to a Drabban. But now Tosfos wants to say that Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos, according to that side in Hillel, only applies to Achila and not to Tiltul Muktza. This is, I think, a fundamental point that should be mentioned as background before we start learning Muktza, that there are two different Isurim. One is Achilas Muktza, the other is Tiltul Muktza, and one, the first, is more chamer than the other. But how does it happen afkemina in the case of Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos or Ein Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos? Tosfos' maskana in this answer is that with regard to Achila, the Issur Achila, we're going to apply Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos. But with regard to Tiltul, Ein Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos. What sense, what logic could you make that? I want to suggest, based on the Ran here has a lashon in explaining Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos. He says, came into Itchi L'Shabbos, Itchi L'Kulei Shabbos, L'Kulei Yoma, and he compares it to Migu Diskatsoy. And he says, just like Migu Diskatsoy, V'bein Hashmashos is Katsoy L'Kulei Yoma, so too came into Itchi L'Kol HaShabbos. Perhaps, and again, I'm working on this very hard. I mean, you gentlemen may think I'm only learning the Masechta Rosh Hashanah now, but I am trying to learn Muktza. I'm asking for Siyat L'Shmai because I want to suggest this for you. Let's go with the first definition of Migu Diskatson. Once it's a Cheftzah D'Isura going into Shabbos, it remains a Cheftzah D'Isura for the entire Shabbos. If we apply that definition, then the Ran is telling us that Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos means Nidche. Nidcha means that now that the rains have soaked up my payros and they're inedible, there's a dichu. Dichu means that for the time being, as long as these payros are not edible, nobody argues with this, that Muktza, that's unquestionable. The only issue is what happens later on when they dry during the course of Shabbos. At that moment that it's Muktza, it becomes a Chefetz D'Isura. If that be the case, Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos means that once it becomes a Chefetz D'Isura, it's a Chefetz D'Isura of Muktza for the entire Shabbos. There's nothing you can do. You could dry it with the hottest sun, but it's already become a Chefetz D'Isura, and we're going to apply the principle similar to Migu, which is called Yesh Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos. However, if I were to go with the other definition of Migu Diskatzoi, that Migu Diskatzoi means I have only one option of Hachana, and that's Hachana going into Shabbos, then logically, Ein Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos, because I was making this. Again, if it was Nolan, it's a different story. We're not talking about Nolan. We're just talking about fruits that got dried, they got wet. So since I had a Hachana on these fruits going into Shabbos, then that Hachana is chal for the entire Shabbos. It, so to speak, spreads its mantle over the entire Shabbos. Is therefore, according to the logic of Muktza, if I go with the definition that Migu Diskatzoi is based on the lack of Hachana, then ain't Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos. Is anyone following? I mean, you are? Okay, I'm happy. I should be happy even if you're not following me, but I'm very happy if you are following me. Because now I think I can explain Tosfos. There's a fundamental difference between the Issur Achila of Muktza and the Issur of Tiltul Muktza. The Issur of Achilas Muktza, which according to the Shita Mekubetzes is Doraisa, and it's derived from V'yichinu es asher yaviru, because you were lacking Hachana, that engenders a Chefetz D'Isura. The Issur Achila means that like any Macholas Asuros, you're not allowed to eat Muktza. If it falls into a Tarobas, then figure out Dover Sheish Matir. If it becomes a Chefetz D'Isura, then we apply the yardstick of the Ran, and we're going to say Migu Diskatzoi. Once it becomes a Chefetz D'Isura, it's a Chefetz D'Isura for the entire Shabbos. But not so Tiltul Muktza. Tiltul Muktza is a different kind of an Issur. Tiltul Muktza is a shmuz. The Gemara says at the end of Masechta Shabbos, Dalit, Atu Tiltul Lav Torchot Tzadin. You start moving things around, and you end up taking them out into Rishus Harabim. That has nothing to do with the Muktza itself. It means I am prohibited because of a shmuz. If Muktza is a shmuz to keep me far away from being metaltel Muktza out into Rishus Harabim, then the Issur of Tiltul Muktza is not something that's inherent in the object. It's simply a question of the lack of hachana. Now we could say, as Tosfos says, Ein Muktza L'Chatzi Shabbos. As far as the Issur Tiltul is concerned, where we're not dealing with a Chefetz D'Isura, you're talking about an Issur Tiltul. Okay, the Issur Tiltul is appropriate for something that lacks hachana, meaning that during the time period when the rains fell down and it's not edible. So at that point, you can talk about a definition of mukt. And you could come along and say that somehow, which is magical, the hachana of Erev Shabbos is now butter. I'm going to be mavatal hachana. Why? Because now it's not edible because the rains fell down. But that bittul hachana is only going to generate an Issur Tiltul, says Tosfos, as long as there's a bittul of hachana. But if I now have a hachana because now it dried out, then I go back to my original hachana. Again, Avril's going to ask me whether it's la'afreya or not, but I go back to my original hachana, and at this point, ein muktza l'chatzi Shabbos. Why should we say muktza l'chatzi Shabbos when logically ein muktza l'chatzi Shabbos? I had a hachana. It must be that the Issur achilas muktza, Tosfos says, is on a different level. It's upgraded because it becomes muktza begufo. It's an Issur beguf hachefetz. And once it becomes asur, it's asur for the balance of Shabbos. That's the chiddush of yesh muktza l'chatzi Shabbos, which Tosfos says that chiddush should be restricted to the Issur achila. When we get to the Issur tiltul, which is an Issur because of the lack of hachana, and the Rabbanan made a shvus to prevent you from hotzah, then we go back to the original position of yesh, of ein muktza l'chatzi Shabbos, because it was mucha. And now we're dealing with a whole different set of operations. Okay. I just want to know how we're doing on the clock. I forget, when do we finish? 5:30. So we still have 15, 20 minutes? Okay. I want to talk to you now. Yeah, go ahead.
That's why.
Because the Torah says this you're not allowed to eat. That's according to Shita Megubetzes. According to the other Rishonim, the Chachamim established that this you're not allowed to eat. Why aren't you allowed to eat it? The answer is because it's mukt. We're not saying that if you eat it, you'll carry it into another rishus. Do you follow what I mean? This is a much more fundamental issue. This is before the shvus of tiltul oto hotzad. It's a separate issue. And if it's a separate issue, then Tosfos says, yesh muktza l'chatzi. I want to talk to you now and see if we can combine these two about another fundamental issue in Muktza, which is called tiltul ayudei davarach, kikar otina. Again, a very complicated suit. There's a Gemara in Masechta Shabbos Kuf Vav Gimel that deals with a maducha sheyesh ba shum. And the Gemara establishes metaltlanos. Agav the shum, and for those who enjoy garlic, agav the shum's good news, you're allowed to be metaltlan. Okay, fine. So from this we derive the conclusion that a klisha malachto le'isur is mutter betiltul etzar kufo, etc., etc. However, the Gemara in Shabbos Adaf Kuf Mem Beis writes, "V'lo amru kikar otinok el mespilvat," which means that as far as moving a corpse, which is muktzah, we're going to allow it by placing a kikar or a tinok. God knows what tinok is going to volunteer for this job, but anyway, a kikar or a tinok on top of the mess. But the Gemara establishes, lo amru kikar o tinok el lemeis bilvad. This is a separate heter l'kavod hames. I want to study with you a few lines in the Baal Hamor. The Baal Hamor is at the bottom of this very long piece here in the Rif, Mem Zayin Amud Beis. He says the following. Ra'isi echad v'chachmei ador. Do you have it? Again, in the standard Talmud Bavli, it should be 4 lines up from the bottom. Shehitil italtil ner shedliku bo bi'osa Shabbos al yidei kikar otino. Wait a minute, the Gemara says, lo yitiu ela nes bilvad. V'nosan tam, v'yanosin tam l'dvarav, the Hodim Ravasi lo amru kikar otino el mes bilvad, dafka mes v'chayotze bo. We're excluding kikar otino in any case that's similar to a dead body, and we're only giving matir for the sake of Toda Brios, for the mess. Kigon, and what would be similar to a mess? Arniki, or avonim. Okay, I'm not sure about arniki here. That's a real challenge. We'll get to that later. Bechol dover she'ein alav toras kli. Very fundamental principle in Muktza. You could have Muktza in a dover she'ein bo toras kli, like an even, eitzim, avonim, etc., afar, tzoros, and you could have Muktza in a kli if it's designated for a meleches Issur, that's called a kli shemalach talis. Aval dover she'yesh alav toras kli, like for example the ner or the arniki, mutter. And I'll prove it to you, says this chacham. Kidisanya meducha im yesh ba shum mitaltlanos. So from the halacha of shum, in the case of meducha, he's going to derive the conclusion that kikar atina works whenever you have a toras kli. That would include ner. Vizu tos gedola. Very nice smicha that he gets from the Balamor. Shameduche mashum harei kit kikdera hamitaltel imatavchio. I think he's applying a principle called bittul, which means that just like you have food in a tavshil, tavshil in a kedera, the kedera is batel, it's only a kli to hold on to the tavshil, and therefore it loses its status. And so too the maducha loses its status because it's holding on to the shul. Uke'ilu hu davar shemalachto leheten. Kol zman shetavshil bo. Okay. A drop louder. Correct. It becomes like a kli otzar, a kli kivum. In other words, I use it in order as a receptacle, and it's the same as a kedera sheyesh potash. But what I'm interested in is this chacham echad. Now, in order to appreciate this chacham echad, we take a look in the Shulchan Aruch, and there are two seifim in the Shulchan Aruch. We start with Shin Ches Sif Hey, and then we go on to Shin Yud Aleph Sif Hey. Yesh matirim litaltel kli shemalachto le'Issur, afilu michama litzeo, which is normally Asur, al yidei kikar otino. And the Taz, in a minute we'll see the Taz in Shin Yud Aleph, says that this is based on the Agos Shri, on the Tur, and on the Tshuva the Rosh. Shin Ches Sif Hey. You have it? Okay. The Taz in Shin Yud Aleph Sif Hey points out that we have what seems to be a stira. Why? Because the Mechaber in Shin Yud Aleph paskins lo hitiru l'taltel al yidei kikar otinok ela b'mes bilvad. Avalo b'shar dvarim ha'asurim l'taltel. The Taz understands that there's going to be a head-on collision here between these two seifim, one in Shin Ches, one in Shin Yud Aleph, with regard to the Ner. Why? Because back in Shin Ches, Yesh Matim L'Taltel, Klisha Malachta L'Issur, the Ner is a Klisha Malachta L'Issur, Al Yidei Kikar Otino. Whereas the Mechaber here in Shin Yud Aleph says that Kikar Otino only applies to a mess.
Not another Dvarim.
Avalo b'shar dvarim.
Another rocks.
What are the shar dvarim? Only rocks? The Taz assumes that shar dvarim includes an air. Because the heter of Kikar Tinok, in the way he reads the Mechaber, is limited to the case of a mess. Anything else that's not a mess, Kikar Tinok is not going to help. Which means that we're excluding the case of an air. Says the Taz, each one of these two seifim are based on two different comments of the Rosh. And in effect, there's a stira between these two comments of the Rosh. One Rosh is in Shuvas HaRosh, which I think you have a photocopy of, and the other statement of the Rosh is in the Piskei HaRosh in Perikat Notel. And here's the deal. In the Shuvas HaRosh, which you'll see on the bottom of your page, he quotes the Ravan. And he writes that Midocha im yesh oleh shum metaltalin, v'afagav di omru, even though the Gemara establishes that the heter of Kikar Tino is only applicable to a mess, Aval Meducha, Kevan Chiyech Oleh Toras Kli, sorry, Litaltala, Agav Ochlin Shalel. The Taz understands that the Tshuvas HaRosh is quoting the Chacham Echad that was quoted by the Baal HaMor, and that the heter of Kikar Otinok applies to anything that's not Mufka, that's not excluded from a Torah's Kli. Once it has a Torah's Kli, ipso facto, you're allowed to move it with a Kikar Otinok on top. So now the Taz has set us up for a Tema Gedola. Why? Because what the Mechaber Paskins here in Shin Yud Aleph Hey is based on the Rosh himself in Perikat Notel, in Piskei HaRosh. He writes, Kosa Rabbeinu Nisim Zal, Yikana Talomed ki elu ha'noshim shenosnim kikar al gabi menorah, shedliku ba b'Shabbos u'metalton also b'makom b'makom, ein osim yofen. How do you reconcile this, asks the Taz, with the Russian Shuvas? The Russian Shuvas accepted the Chacham Echad of the Baal HaMor, who said that anything that has a Torah's Kli is metalfulo al yidei davar acher, al yidei kikar tino, including a ner and an arniki. It has a Torah's Kli. And yet the Rosh himself in Piskei HaRosh, quoted here by the Shulchan Aruch in Shin Yud Ches, says that Kikar Otinok only works in the case of mess, implying that Kikar Otinok would not be effective and be matir, tiltul, in the case of a ner or an arniki. And the language of the Taz here in Shin Yud Aleph, he says, Tema, Maishna, Tema Machikosa, Mahanya, he says, take a look in Siman Shin Ches, if hey, and Mahanya, you can use Kikar Tino, because the Mechaber in Shin Hey was Matir Kikar Tino. And yet, here in Shin Yud Aleph, he says that anything except a mess is also Bekipur Tina. He says, Lama lo yoil sham, meaning in the case of a klisha malachta leisa, Kikar Tina, Tfei Mikan. Why is Kikar Tina operative and more of a kula in the case of klisha malachta leisa than it is here in the case of a ner? Vitarti hani piske the rosh. He says, Hahi, the Siman Shinches is the Chuvas Harosh. That was the earlier Machaber, based on the Chuvas Harosh to be Mekil on Kino, Kikar, and Tina. But here in Shin Yud Aleph, his Piske Harosh, compared to Kadnotim. Vitarte Hani Piske Dirosh Sasrinin. There's a contradiction between these two Piskei. And the Bir Agra in Simon Shin Ches quotes the Taz. Taz hisig al Shulchan Aruch, aval ein kushyaso klum. Again, one of those very stark lashonos. And he says the following. The benora shedliko Muktza machmas Issur tidachyo biyadayin afilu tzor gufos v'huadin o harehi kimo arniki. What's he saying? Very short, as usual, abridged biragra. But I believe, they will talk about this more barichus at a different occasion because we're running out of time, that the Gon is making a fundamental distinction between two categories of Issur. One is Muktza, and in the language of the Rosh, he calls it Dachya Biyadayim, and that applies both in the case of Ner and Arniki, as opposed to the case of a Klisha Malachta L'Issur. A Klisha Malachta L'Issur is not Muktza. We call it Muktza, but it's not really Muktza. It's a separate Issur tiltal. In the case of Ner, that's called Muktza Machmas Issur. If you take a look carefully in the Chuvas HaRosh, you'll see it. It's almost black and white. On the second line of the Chuvas HaRosh, he speaks about Muktza Machmas Issur, Kagon, Ner Shidliku Ba'oso Shabbos. And if you skip down a line, V'chein Kis Sheyesh Bo Mos. Then you go down to the fourth category that the Rosh has. It's kedai to see the whole Rosh as an introduction. Hamin Araviu Dovra Muktza Machmas Malachto. It's a Meleches Issur. What he's talking about is Kurnus Linafachim, right? A carpenter's hammer. That's something that is a Klisha Malachta L'Issur. And he says in this case of the fourth category of Klisha Malachta L'Issur, Yesh Lo Heter, Afilu Michamal Itzel, Al Yedei Kikar Otino. Now he quotes the Ravan. In other words, the Ravan is going to be a basis for being matir, coming out of Midoch Shesh Bashum, anything that has a Torah's Kli, which is not Muktza, but rather it's Malachta L'Issur. And if it's a Klisha Malachta L'Issur, then it's Mutter with Kikar and Tinok. But in the case of Muktza Machmas Issur, for example, Ner, Shuvdolek, or Arniki Sheyesh Bo Mos, in those two cases, it's real bona fide Muktza. And if it's bona fide Muktza, there's no heter. Ayadei Kikar Tinok. Why? What's the difference? But I think in the light of everything we said, we can now understand the Rosh and how the Gra reconciled the kasha of the Taz. When you have something that's Muktza, then the Torah says, or the Rabbanan say, that it's a chefza d'isura. the Issur of Hadlaka now encompasses the object itself, and the object becomes Gufo Shel Muktza. And once it's Gufo Shel Muktza, then you're not allowed to relocate the Muktza. If you relocate the Muktza, I don't care if there's a kik or a tinok on it, but the Muktza went from point A to point B. Not so in the case of a Klisha Malachta L'Issur. A Klisha Malachta L'Issur is an Issur Tiltul, it's not Muktza. And we're going to have a long discussion to prove this from the Heter of L'Tzor Kufa, L'Tzor Makoma, that's for a different shir. But be that as it may, now I begin to understand why Kikar Otino is going to be meaningful when there's no Muktza, not like the case of Ner and Arniki, but in the case of a Klisha Malachta L'Issur and a Klisha Malachta L'Issur, the Rabbanon instituted a shvus mishum hotza of an Issur tiltul, but the chefetz itself is not muksa. So that now I have a right to say, what am I being metaltel? Well, what am I being metaltel? That depends upon my relationship. I can decide that I am carrying the kikar of the tino. So my tiltul is on the kikar of the tino. I only carry them by carrying the kli that's underneath them. But if I have a kli, and let's say I would put a kikar or a tino on top of a hammer, of a nafach, of a kurdish al nafachim, then I have a right to say that I'm carrying the hammer in order to relocate the kikar of the tino. So when I'm talking about an Issur tiltul, when there's nothing inherent in the chefetz, it's not really muktza at all. It's not a chefetz of Issur, it's only an Issur gavra, it's an Issur tiltul. Now I could say that my tiltul relates to the kikar tino. If I have something that's a chefetz of muktza, it's muktza machmas Issur, then the entire object now, begufo, is a chefetz of Issura. So what are you going to tell me? You didn't relocate the object? For sure you did. You took it from one place to the other. In tiltul, you could be machalek and say, well, my tiltul was here and not there. But we're talking about an Issur in the chefetz. I can't relocate the chefetz. What difference it make whether it's a kikar or tino? And that, I believe, could be pshat in the Gon to reconcile the Piskei Shulchan Aruch and the two statements of it. Okay, then we'll stop here.
That's why the Rosh probably says "Ner shidlikim b'os Shabbos." Because only then it's kibbutz. That's just sitting in the closet. That's probably just a
Correct.
But why
It's
would
got to be a likamos of Shabbos, because once it's a likamos of Shabbos, there's a dechia. Once I was dochid, it becomes a chefetz b'isur of muktza.
So why when it's just Issur tiltul? I could say okay, my puzzle, but just genetic bread or
Because when you talk about tiltul, you can always ask the question, what was his interest in tiltul? You tell me that.
So if you want to move the baby, you can pick up the baby and move it, not with the mace.
Okay, that I understand. The Chachamim organized it in such a way that, it's kind of like
Get around the
haram of some sort. But what the haram is understood, I can define it. I can say something. I can say that if it's an Issur gavra tiltul, well, when am I being metaltal? And then you play the games. And it could be that once he puts a kikar or tino on it, Einoch Hinami, he wants to move the kikar or tino. But in the case of a chefetz of muktza, where the Issur is inherent begufo shel chayfetz, then if you relocate the chayfetz, you have violated the Issur. It doesn't matter whether it's a kikar or tino. Okay, we'll stop here.
No, I should try on Friday.
Thanks.
But think of that. It's lots.
Yeah, there's a lot here. I'm telling you, it's